All right, let's look at the market structure of monopoly. Um, we we talked last week about perfect competition and the characteristics of perfect competition. There were many buyers and sellers. No buyer and seller had any market control or market power. This is the opposite. Okay, monopoly, we're dealing with a single supplier. So we have one supplier of a product who is really going to provide for the entire downward sloping demand curve. So one supplier is supplying the entire market of likely many buyers. So a sole supplier of a product with no close substitutes. And this is important in order to have a monopoly. Remember when we talked about the characteristics of perfect competition, the goods were homogeneous or identical. In a monopoly situation, they are unique. There are no substitutes. So an important concept comes up in our other market structures. With perfect competition, there were no barriers to entry, meaning new firms could get in at any time. With monopoly, there are what we call complete barriers to entry. Monopoly is the most profitable market structure, and for that profit motive would draw many new firms. However, what allows a monopoly to remain as a sole supplier are these barriers to entry, or these are the impediments that prevent new firms from joining the industry and competing on an equal basis with the firms that are already there. And it is these barriers, right, that allow the monopoly to exist. So one of your questions talks about barriers to entry, and we're going to go through several of them here. Some of them include legal restrictions, economies of scale, which is an important one to understand, in the control of essential resources. So we'll kind of get through each of those three here. When it comes to legal restrictions, you have probably heard of the word a patent before. And what a patent is a legal device that allows you to have exclusive rights to sell a good or service that you have created or come up with for 20 years. It used to be 17. I believe it has been increased up to 20 now. So you come up with an idea, a new medication, something like a cure for a vaccine for the coronavirus. You have the right to patent that and be the exclusive provider and profiteer off of that for 20 years. After 20 years, then generics are allowed to be made. So this is kind of that balance between giving some incentive for innovation, right, the high profit for innovation, but also the allowing of kind of market forces and competition to take over after a while. So you get incentive that allows you to earn profit for 20 years, and then after that you'd have to face open competition. Other ones are licenses and other restrictions. Things I can think of when it comes to licenses is that government allows certain individual firms the right to exclusively supply an area. And you see this a lot with public utilities or cable companies. In Winthrop, if you're going to get cable TV, you have to get it from Mediacom. My brother lives in Rochester. He gets it from Comcast. The local governments give certain firms or a single firm the ability to provide all of the members of that society, of that group or that area, geographic area, with that particular good. And we'll explain why government does that. So let's look at kind of the next one, which we call economies of scale. And this kind of answers why governments allows certain firms to have the exclusive right to supply a particular good. And that's because of this concept of economies of scale. When economies of scale take place, and I'll explain kind of what this is here, what happens is we see natural monopolies occur. So on some of your assessments, this will be an important piece to remember. What causes natural monopolies to occur? It's this idea of economies of scale. What economies of scale are is we see costs in the long run. So our average costs are falling the more that we are producing of a good or service. try to think of a way to example to explain this. If you let me go to this graph here next. Maybe this will make sense. If you look at this graph, you see it's downward sloping, and this is our cost per unit. Okay, and this is our quantity. So as we go out and produce more of a good or service, you can see that our average costs are falling for each unit. And what this means essentially is, let's just say if we come down here and this is the first unit, and the costs are way up here. So extremely high cost. What that is telling us is that that first unit has probably some fixed costs associated with it, and it's very expensive to provide that very first unit. Now, this high level of likely fixed costs, okay, once you spread it out over more units of production, goods 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, on to the thousands to millions, as you produce more and more, these fixed costs are spread out over more and more goods. So that means your average costs, the more you produce, are falling. So what this kind of makes occur naturally, in the idea of a natural monopoly, is that the firm that has the highest output, okay, so what would we call the largest firm, is going to have the advantage of economies of scale. So let's say that the cell phone industry, there's very few cell phone carriers. Verizon, AT&T are really the major players, and you can kind of imagine, in order to get the first communication to happen, you need to have an entire network established. You have to have a satellite or multiple satellites, and if you're going to have all of those costs for one or two phones to call each other, think of the cost. It'd be incredible. But as you add more and more and more, and they can all use the same infrastructure, use these same satellites, right? The costs fall and fall and fall, and the more people you sign up, the more your costs fall. So the largest firm is going to be able to provide the service at the lowest average cost, and at the lowest cost, they'd provide it the cheapest rate. So if somebody tried to come in, a new cell phone tried to get in, a company and tried to get in and compete with AT&T and Verizon, they are competing against this economies of scale. As they are just starting out and they have fewer buyers, their costs are still up here. And what Verizon and AT&T can do is they can stay in at a lower cost. They're providing more. They can essentially run this party out of business, and what will likely happen is one of these two firms, Verizon or AT&T, will go in, buy them out, and then take their customer base. And you've seen that with Sprint and a lot of these that are just they're contracting, and there's incentive to join because of this idea of economies of scale. So the important pieces to think about here, as output increases, as we produce more of a good or service, we move along this line, average costs are falling. Okay? As average costs start to rise again eventually, we call that diseconomies of scale. But that is important to understand. And the last one then is control of essential resources. So if you happen to control some natural resource or some critical resource to your good or service, then you are able to establish what we call monopoly power. A couple example here, De Beers Diamond Mine De Beers Diamonds owns 92% some odd percent of the world's diamond mines. You own the diamonds, you have the cornerstone on the diamond market. Professional sports leagues, the NFL is a great example. They limit that to 30 teams, 32 teams, 30 teams, whatever it is. You just can't go out and start your own NFL team. The professional league, right, controls all of the teams under its umbrella. So if you have a control of some essential resource, that will allow you to have monopoly control. Again, supplying something that others can't match. So this is that unique experience, that unique product. Monopolies can be, established in local, national, and international. We don't see a lot of monopolies that aren't governed by government. Monopolies are illegal. Our government in the United States likes to have competition. So, but you do see, local utilities, local cable, those sort of things that government gives permission to. When our telephone industry was first starting up, the U.S. government got into business with AT&T and said, "All right, we will allow you to have a complete monopoly, but we're going to regulate your price as long as you provide long distance. You know, at a reasonable rate, we'll allow you to operate as a monopoly." Well, cell phone technology comes along, and we no longer need to string a wire across the entire country in order to talk to each other. So that then brings in new firms, new competition. And that's what's talking about kind of technological change, why long-lasting monopolies are rare, because economic profits attract new competitors, new innovations, new ideas. Yeah, so that's kind of the basic explanation of what a monopoly is, and it's kind of barriers to entry that allow it to take place. Next video, I'm going to talk about the marginal revenue or the revenue of a monopoly and how that works.